At the funeral of the twin sisters, a strange man appeared and poured some kind of liquid into their mouths. What happened next will shock everyone. The sky had grown darker over the last hour, but Marta barely noticed. Her hands rested on her lap, fingers twisting a faded blue ribbon, the only thing left from her childhood that felt like hers. She wasn't one to cry often, but this evening, her heart felt heavier than it had since she could remember. Weston hadn't come home again. Not that it was surprising anymore, but the emptiness gnawed at her differently tonight. For months, whispers in the village had tickled her ears whenever she went to the market or fetched water from the well. They weren't just about Weston's absence, they were about his presence elsewhere. "He's been seen with the widow in Rivertown," one of the neighbors had murmured to another, loud enough for Marta to hear. And not just once or twice. Marta tightened her grip on the ribbon, her nails digging into her palms. She couldn't blame the widow, not really. It wasn't her fault that Weston never truly loved her. Marta had known it all along, even on their wedding day, but she had hoped, oh, how she had hoped, that things would change. "He'll see what kind of wife I am," she had told herself back then. "He'll realize he doesn't need anything else." And for a short while, she thought it might be true. She cooked his favorite meals, kept the house spotless, even took up fishing just to spend time with him. Yet his love remained elusive, as slippery as the trout in the streams he frequented. The marriage, in truth, had always been lopsided. Marta was 20 when she'd finally dared to confess her feelings to Weston, a man 15 years her senior. He had looked at her with something between surprise and amusement, as if she were a child declaring she'd discovered a secret about the world. Still, he had accepted her offer, and soon after, they were wed. In the early days, she convinced herself that his quietness was just his way of loving. He wasn't a man of words, but surely his actions meant something. When he sat by the fire, cleaning his hunting knives, and she brought him tea, wasn't that a shared moment? When they worked side by side in the vegetable garden, didn't that mean they were building something together? But the nights in their small home told a different story. Marta would lie awake, staring at the wooden beams overhead, while Weston slept soundly beside her, never once reaching out, never once asking how she was feeling or what she dreamed about. The weight of that silence grew, and no matter how much Marta tried to fill the void with kindness or devotion, it remained. The final blow came after 5 years of marriage. They had tried for a child, prayed for one even, but month after month, nothing changed. The local doctor assured Marta that her body was healthy, capable. "Sometimes these things take time," he'd said, but the words offered little comfort. Weston, meanwhile, withdrew further. His absence from their home became more frequent and prolonged. One evening, Marta confronted him. "Weston," she began, her voice shaking, "do you even want to be here anymore?" He didn't answer right away, his gaze fixed on the hunting bow he was restringing. "Don't ask questions you don't want the answer to," he finally muttered. She didn't ask again. When Weston left for what would be the last time, he didn't bother with an excuse. He simply packed a small bag, slung it over his shoulder, and walked out the door. Marta watched him disappear down the dirt road, feeling a strange mixture of relief and despair. The following weeks were a blur. Without Weston, the house felt cavernous, though it was no bigger than it had been before. Marta busied herself with chores, kept to herself in the village, and avoided the judgmental eyes of the neighbors as best she could. Life went on, hollow as it was. Then, one market day, everything shifted. Marta had been inspecting a basket of apples when a voice, smooth and warm as summer rain, spoke behind her. "Those are good ones," it said. but the pairs a stall over are even better. She turned to see a man she didn't recognize, his face weathered but kind, a spark of mischief in his eyes. He introduced himself as Sam, a traveler passing through. The conversation was brief, but something in his manner, his easy smile, the way he didn't seem to look through her like so many others did, stayed with Marta long after he'd walked away. Over the next few weeks, Sam became a regular sight in the village, and more often than not, he seemed to find reasons to cross paths with Marta. He helped her carry firewood one day, fixed the broken handle of her water pail another. His attention was gentle, unhurried, and for the first time in years, Marta felt seen. It wasn't long before Sam began visiting her home. They'd talk for hours by the fire, his stories of distant places filling the space Weston's silence had left. Marta found herself laughing again, something she hadn't done in what felt like ages. With Sam, hope crept back into her heart, tentative but persistent. Marta wasn't sure when it happened, but Sam had become as much a part of her days as the rising and setting sun. His presence brought warmth to her home, his laughter chasing away the shadows that had lingered long after Weston's departure. Each evening, as they shared quiet moments by the fire, Marta began to believe that maybe, just maybe, happiness wasn't something meant to elude her forever. But hope, she'd learn, could be a cruel thing. It started small, a missed visit, then two. "Got caught up," he'd say, offering a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Marta brushed it off at first. Sam was a man of the road, after all. He wasn't like her, bound to the same patch of earth, to a life rooted in routine and responsibility. Still, doubt began to creep in, as subtle and insidious as the first frost of winter. One morning, Marta stood at the window, her hands resting on the curve of her belly. She hadn't meant for it to happen, not really. It wasn't as if she'd planned this new life growing inside her. But now that it was there, a fragile promise of a future she never thought she'd have, Marta felt something she hadn't in years, a sense of purpose. She'd been waiting for Sam to come back since the day she told him. "I'm pregnant," she'd said, her voice soft, almost apologetic. His reaction had been muted, a faint nod, the furrow of his brow deepening as he muttered something about needing to clear his head. That had been 3 days ago. The note, when it came, wasn't much of a surprise. She found it on the kitchen table, the handwriting as neat and precise as the man himself. "Marta, I wish I could be the man you need me to be, but I'm not. Take care of yourself and the baby. You'll do fine without me. Sam." Her fingers trembled as she read it, the words blurring together as tears filled her eyes. For a long while she stood there, unmoving. Then, with deliberate slowness, she folded the note in half and tucked it into the pocket of her apron. She had cried enough over men who couldn't stay. When Sophie and Alina were born, Marta refused to let the villagers' whispers affect her. The midwife, a stout woman with a kind face, had stayed longer than necessary, helping Marta swaddle the tiny girls in blankets that smelled faintly of lavender. "They're beautiful," the woman had said, her voice filled with genuine warmth. "You've been given a blessing, Marta. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." But blessings, Marta knew, often came with a price. The villagers' judgment was swift and unrelenting. Every trip to the market, every Sunday service, she felt their stares, heard their muttered words. "2 daughters, no husband," one woman hissed as Marta passed, her arms laden with sacks of flour. "What kind of example is that?" Marta didn't bother responding. Let them talk, let them sneer. Sophie and Alina were hers, and that was all that mattered. At night, as the girls slept, Marta would sit by their cradle, her fingers tracing the edges of the carved wood Weston had once made for her. You'll have a better life, she whispered, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. I'll make sure of it. Weston's return was as abrupt as his departure. Marta was in the garden, pulling weeds from between the rows of carrots, when she saw him walking up the dirt path. He looked older, his hair streaked with grey, his frame thinner than she remembered. He didn't call out, didn't even glance her way. Instead, he strode past her toward the house, his steps purposeful. By the time Marta entered the kitchen, Weston had already begun packing the few belongings he'd left behind. His fishing rod, a pair of boots, the pocket knife he'd once used to carve her name into the tree behind their home. They're yours now, Marta said, her voice cold as she gestured toward the knife. Weston didn't respond. He moved with the efficiency of a man who'd made this decision long before he set foot on her doorstep. What do you want me to tell them? She asked, folding her arms across her chest. When they're old enough to ask about you. He paused then, his shoulders stiffening. Tell them whatever you want, he said, his tone flat. It doesn't matter. And with that, he was gone. As the years passed, Marta's resolve hardened. The men in her life, West and Sam, had taught her one thing. Men brought pain. Sophie and Alina would not suffer the way she had. She would protect them, even if it meant building walls they couldn't break free from. No boys, she told them one evening as they sat at the kitchen table, their hands sticky with dough from the bread they were learning to knead. Not until you're older, 25 at least. Sophie, the older by just a few minutes, frowned. Why 25? Because by then, you'll know better. You'll see the kind of tricks men play. You won't let them use you. Alina didn't say anything, but her eyes, wide and curious, met her sister's. There was something unspoken between them, a quiet understanding that their mother wouldn't change her mind. Marta reached out, brushing a strand of hair from Sophie's forehead. I just want you to have the life I didn't. That's not too much to ask, is it? The girls shook their heads, but deep down, Marta wondered if they truly understood. As the years passed, the weight of Marta's rules settled over the house like an ever-present shadow. Sophie and Alina grew, their faces maturing into delicate reflections of their mother's youthful beauty, but their lives remained confined within the walls of the small home. Marta's voice, sharp and resolute, echoed through their days. The world out there isn't kind to girls like you. Sophie, the bolder of the two, often pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the kitchen window, watching the village children play in the meadow. Their laughter carried on the wind, teasing her like a melody she wasn't allowed to learn. Sometimes, she'd trace her finger along the condensation, drawing little shapes as though imagining a life outside. Alina, on the other hand, busied herself with books or sewing, her quiet acceptance a stark contrast to her sister's restless spirit. Their social world was limited to the occasional church service and brief trips to the market under Marta's watchful eye. Even there, Marta kept a firm grip on their arms, her glare silencing any curious glances from the local boys. You look straight ahead, she'd mutter under her breath, her grip tightening if either girl so much as turned her head. At night, the sisters would sit in their shared room, their twin beds separated by a single nightstand. Sophie often whispered into the dark, her frustration bubbling over. Don't you ever wonder what it's like? To go to the dances they talk about, to laugh with people our age. Alina would shift in her bed, staring at the ceiling. Mama says it's not safe, she'd reply, her voice steady but distant. She just wants what's best for us. Sophie's sigh would cut through the quiet. I don't want to be like her, always afraid, always alone. By the time Sophie turned 17, Marta's health began to falter. At first it was just small things, the way she'd pause halfway up the stairs clutching the railing or the slight tremor in her hands when she poured tea. But soon, the signs became impossible to ignore. The color drained from her face, and her once commanding voice softened, reduced to strained whispers. The doctor's visit confirmed what Marta already suspected. "You don't have long," he said gently, avoiding her daughter's wide-eyed stares. "A year? Maybe less." Marta refused to let her girls see her cry. Instead, she focused on ensuring that they would carry her lessons long after she was gone. Lying in her bed, propped up by pillows, she called them to her side. Her voice, though weak, carried the same unyielding conviction as ever. "You promise me," she said, her pale hand reaching out to clasp Sophie's. "No boys, no foolish dreams. You keep your heads down and you'll be fine." Alina nodded immediately, her lips trembling as she fought back tears. Sophie hesitated, her gaze flickering to the window where the evening light painted the sky in soft hues of orange and pink. "Sophie," Marta pressed, her tone firmer. "Promise me." "I promise," Sophie murmured, though her voice lacked the certainty her mother sought. 2 weeks later, the house was quiet in a way it hadn't been before. Marta's absence felt like a void, her presence still lingering in the echoes of the rooms she once ruled. The girls sat together in the parlor, the fire crackling softly, neither one speaking. Sophie stared at her hands, the promise she'd made weighing heavily on her mind. For the first time, the world felt wide open, and the thought both thrilled and terrified her. She glanced at Alina, who sat rigidly, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "What do we do now?" Sophie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alina didn't look up. "What Mama wanted. We follow the rules." Sophie frowned. The rules didn't make her happy. Why should they make us? Alina's eyes flashed with something close to anger as she finally turned to her sister. Because she believed in them. She believed they'd keep us safe. Safe from what? Sophie shot back, her voice rising. Life, love, mistakes. I don't want to live my whole life afraid of what might happen. Alina shook her head, her jaw tightening. You don't understand. Mama gave everything for us. She gave us fear, Sophie interrupted, her tone sharp. And I'm tired of being afraid. The room fell silent, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the distant hoot of an owl outside. Sophie rose, her movements deliberate as she walked to the window and pushed it open. The cool night air rushed in, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and earth. I'm going to live, she said quietly, almost to herself. Not just survive. Alina didn't respond. Instead, she sat frozen, staring at the space her sister had just occupied, torn between loyalty to their mother's memory and the tiny, unspoken desire to follow Sophie's lead. As the moonlight spilled into the room, painting their faces in silver, the unspoken truth settled between them. The promise they'd made to Marta was already beginning to fracture, and neither of them could quite decide whether that was a betrayal or a beginning. It began innocently enough, or so Sophie told herself. Logan Jones was just another face in the village, a name whispered among the girls who gathered at the market. She'd seen him now and again, always with that easy smile and the kind of confidence that seemed out of place in their quiet, unremarkable town. When he first spoke to her, she thought it was nothing more than politeness. But then it happened again. And again. At 17, Sophie thought she was different. She wasn't like the other girls who giggled behind their hands when a boy looked their way. She was smart, careful, aware of the traps her mother had warned about. When Logan started walking her home from the market, she didn't feel alarmed. She felt flattered. She thought herself clever enough to play along without falling too deep. Weeks turned into months. And before long, Sophie found herself drawn to the way Logan spoke about things beyond the village. He painted pictures of cities she'd never seen, places where the world was bigger and brighter than she'd ever imagined. "You could come with me someday," he'd said once, his voice low and inviting. The words settled in her chest, equal parts thrilling and terrifying. She told herself it was harmless, a secret, something just for her, away from the weight of her mother's rules and Alina's quiet judgment. But in the quiet moments, when she was alone in her room, she couldn't ignore the unease that lingered at the edges of her thoughts. A year later, Alina stood in the same place Sophie had been, drawn into Logan's orbit with a gravity she couldn't explain. She wasn't like her sister, bold and questioning. Alina was quieter, more cautious. But when Logan spoke to her, she felt seen in a way that was new and intoxicating. It started with simple kindnesses. He'd help her carry her basket at the market, offer a hand when she stumbled on uneven ground. His attention felt like sunlight breaking through the clouds of her otherwise mundane days. When he told her she was different, special, she believed him. She didn't know about Sophie. How could she? Her sister had never mentioned Logan, and Alina didn't dare bring up her own budding feelings. Marta's warning still rang in her ears, even though their mother was gone. Don't trust a man too easily. They'll tell you what you want to hear, but it doesn't mean it's true. Alina convinced herself that this was different. Logan was different. She kept her secret, thinking she was sparing Sophie the burden of her disobedience. Logan, for his part, managed his deception with practiced ease. To Sophie, he was the adventurous soul, longing to escape the confines of the village. To Alina, he was the tender confidant who listened to her every word as though it were poetry. He played his roles so convincingly that neither sister suspected the truth. On a warm spring evening, Logan promised Sophie he'd take her to see the ocean. "It's bigger than anything you can imagine," he said, his eyes alight with excitement. "One day, you'll stand on the shore and wonder how you ever lived without seeing it." 2 nights later, he whispered to Alina under the stars, "You're the only one who understands me. I've never felt this way about anyone before." Neither girl doubted his sincerity. Neither girl realized they weren't alone in his affections. When the changes started, they were subtle. Sophie found herself more tired than usual, her appetite unpredictable. She brushed it off as the lingering effects of a late winter cold. But as the weeks wore on, the signs became harder to ignore. The nausea, the missed cycles, it all pointed to something she wasn't ready to admit. Alina noticed similar symptoms but convinced herself it was nothing. She hadn't spoken to Sophie about Logan, and she certainly wasn't about to reveal this new worry. She told herself she'd get better, that it was just a phase. It wasn't until a particularly bad morning when Sophie stumbled into the kitchen, pale and shaky, that Alina finally spoke up. "You look awful," Alina said, her voice tinged with concern. Sophie waved her off, taking a seat at the worn kitchen table. "I'm fine, just tired." Alina hesitated, then glanced at her sister's profile, the tension in her expression too familiar to ignore. "Sophie," she said slowly, Are you sick?" Sophie's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" Alina's hands fidgeted in her lap. "I mean, I've been feeling strange too, like something's wrong." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The truth hung between them, unspoken but undeniable. "You don't think—" Sophie started, then trailed off, her voice breaking. Alina shook her head, panic flickering across her face. "No, it can't be." But deep down, they both knew the answer. And as realization settled over them, so did a crushing silence. Logan's charm hadn't dimmed when Sophie told him about the life growing inside her. She had rehearsed the conversation a dozen times in her mind, imagining his reaction, the joy, the concern, the promises. Instead, when she finally blurted it out, his face barely changed. "That's something," he said, his voice measured, his smile steady. "Guess we'll have to figure things out." Sophie's heart fluttered. He didn't seem angry or panicked. It was enough for her to push aside her doubts. "We'll figure it out together," she said softly, her hand reaching for his. Logan's smile widened, though it didn't reach his eyes. He squeezed her hand briefly before changing the subject. "Why don't we celebrate? I'll cook you dinner next week. Something special." Sophie didn't notice how his grip tightened for just a second too long. Alina's confession to Logan followed a similar path. When she told him, her voice trembling and her hands clutching at the hem of her dress, he gave her the same steady response. "That's something," he said, leaning in to kiss her forehead. "Don't worry, Izzy. We'll make it work." Alina felt the tension in her chest ease. She had been so afraid. Of his reaction, of what Sophie might discover, of what her life would become. But Logan had calmed all those fears in an instant. His presence, his words, were like a balm to her frayed nerves. He kissed her goodbye that evening, promising they'd talk more soon. As Alina walked home, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe everything would be all right. Logan, meanwhile, walked to the edge of the village, his steps purposeful. He slipped into the woods, his mind churning. 2 lives tangled together, 2 secrets he couldn't afford to let unravel. He had to act. A few days later, Logan invited Sophie to his small cabin at the edge of the village. She arrived as the sun dipped below the horizon, the soft glow of lantern light spilling through the windows. He greeted her with his usual warmth, ushering her inside and gesturing to a table already set with 2 plates of steaming stew. "Made it just for you," he said, pulling out a chair for her. Sophie smiled, feeling a rush of affection. She took her seat, the warmth of the room and Logan's steady presence soothing her nerves. They talked as they ate, Logan weaving tales of the adventures they could have together, far away from the judgment of the village. She barely noticed the bitterness in the stew. Alina's invitation came the next evening. Logan's cabin felt smaller this time, the shadows longer. He was just as attentive, just as charming. She didn't hesitate when he handed her a cup of tea, the steam curling into the air between them. "You're safe with me," he said, his voice low and soothing. "Always." Alina drank deeply, the warmth of the tea spreading through her chest. She didn't notice the faint metallic tang. By the time Sophie returned home, the pain had begun. It started as a dull ache in her stomach, growing sharper with every passing minute. She stumbled through the front door, clutching her abdomen, her face pale and twisted with agony. Alina was already there, seated at the kitchen table. She turned at the sound of her sister's uneven footsteps, her own face ghostly white. "Izzy!" Sophie gasped, doubling over. Alina stood, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Sophie, what's wrong?" Before Sophie could answer, the pain in Alina's stomach erupted, sharp and relentless. She fell to her knees, her hands trembling as she reached for her sister. I think it was Logan." Alina choked out, her voice barely audible over the pounding in Sophie's ears. Sophie's eyes widened, her breath hitching. "Logan? What do you mean, Logan?" Alina's words came in gasps, her voice weakening. He did this. I don't—" The room spun around them, the pain blinding. Sophie collapsed beside her sister, her thoughts a swirl of betrayal, disbelief, and fear. She heard Alina's breathing falter before the darkness claimed them both. When the neighbors found the sisters, they assumed the worst. Their still forms, pale and lifeless, spoke of tragedy too common to question. "Poor girls," one woman muttered, crossing herself. "So young." The village moved quickly, as small towns often do. There were no surviving family members to contact, no one to delay the inevitable. The funeral was arranged within a day, the sisters' bodies placed in simple coffins and carried to the cemetery on the edge of town. The villagers gathered in hushed silence, their faces solemn as the coffins were lowered into the earth. No one noticed the faint movement of Sophie's hand beneath the shroud. No one heard the soft gasp that escaped Alina's lips, muffled by the weight of wood and soil. The priest's words drifted over the crowd, a prayer for peace that fell heavy in the air. May their souls find rest. But rest was not what awaited Sophie and Alina. The first sign was a cough. Soft at first, almost imperceptible beneath the priest's steady murmur of prayers. Then another, rougher, rattling through the still air. The sound brought an uneasy ripple through the gathered crowd. Heads turned toward the simple wooden coffins, their expressions a mix of confusion and growing dread. Weston pushed his way to the front, his steps deliberate, his face set with grim determination. At 75, his frame was thinner than in his youth, but his presence still commanded attention. The murmurs rose as he reached the graves, his weathered hands gripping the edge of the first coffin. "Step back," he ordered, his voice gravelly but firm. The villagers froze, uncertainty rooting them to the ground. When no one moved, he repeated louder this time, "I said, step back." With trembling hands, Weston unlatched the coffin lid and lifted it away. The crowd gasped, their collective horror growing as he did the same with the second coffin. Sophie and Alina lay inside, pale and unmoving. But even in death, there was a faint flicker of something. Not life, not yet, but the fragile possibility of it. Weston reached into his coat and withdrew a small vial of liquid, the color deep and amber. Without hesitation, he uncorked it and poured a small amount into Sophie's mouth. Her chest rose sharply, her breath ragged as her body struggled against the pull of unconsciousness. Moments later, he repeated the act with Alina. At first, nothing happened. The crowd edged backward, their whispers blending into a nervous hum. Then Sophie's eyelids fluttered. Her hand twitched. She drew in a deep, shuddering breath. The villagers erupted into chaos. "Witchcraft!" someone cried, their voice high and panicked. "Stay back!" another warned, pulling their children close. Alina stirred next, her fingers gripping the sides of her coffin as if clawing her way out of a nightmare. She bolted upright, gasping, her wide eyes darting between the faces of the terrified crowd and her sister, who now sat upright as well. Weston ignored the pandemonium around him. He steadied both girls with a hand on each of their shoulders. "You're safe now," he said, his voice steady but low. "We need to leave. Quickly." The villagers were too consumed by fear to stop them. Some ran, clutching rosaries and muttering prayers. Others stared, paralyzed, as Weston led the girls away from the cemetery and into the dense woods that surrounded the village. Sophie stumbled, her legs weak beneath her. Alina clutched at her side, still trembling. Weston paused, letting them catch their breath. He studied them for a moment, his eyes shadowed with regret. "You must be wondering what just happened," he began, his tone heavy. "And why I was there." Sophie spoke first, her voice raw. We were dead, weren't we? I remember. The pain. Then nothing." Alina shuddered, wrapping her arms around herself. "How are we here? How are we alive?" Weston sighed, his shoulders sagging. "I wish I could give you an easy answer, but the truth is, I've been watching over you. Since Marta passed." His voice faltered at the mention of her name, but he pressed on. "I knew something was wrong when I saw Logan leaving the toxicologist's office in town. He looked smug, too smug. It made my stomach turn. By the time I pieced it together, it was almost too late." Sophie's jaw clenched at the mention of Logan's name, the memory of his betrayal still fresh and searing. "You knew? You knew about him? About us?" Weston hesitated, then nodded. "I didn't know the full truth, not until I heard the whispers around the village, but I knew enough to know he was trouble." "Why didn't you tell us?" Alina's voice broke, her question sharp and accusing. "Why didn't you stop him?" "I failed you," Weston admitted, the weight of his guilt etched into every line of his face. "I thought I had time. I didn't want to meddle too much, not after everything with Marta. But when I found you, when I saw what he'd done, I couldn't let it end that way." Sophie shook her head, her fists clenching. "He tried to kill us. He nearly succeeded." "But he didn't," Weston said firmly, "because I was there, and I'll be there again if I have to be." The sisters exchanged a glance, their emotions a storm of confusion, anger, and gratitude. Sophie turned back to Weston, her voice quieter now. "What was it? The thing you gave us?" Weston held up the empty vial, the light catching on its surface. "Something I hoped I'd never need. It's not magic, not really, but it's powerful. A remedy for poisons and other unnatural things. It's not meant to bring back the dead, but it can stop someone from crossing that line. If they haven't gone too far." Alina frowned. "How did you even get something like that?" Weston hesitated again, then shook his head. "There's a lot you don't know about me, about Marta, but we don't have time for all the answers tonight. We need to get you somewhere safe." Sophie opened her mouth to argue, but Weston cut her off with a raised hand. "You're alive. That's what matters now. And you need to stay that way." As they continued through the woods, the weight of what had happened began to settle on the sisters. They had been pulled back from the edge, but at a cost neither of them fully understood. And though Weston's words had brought some comfort, they couldn't erase the chilling realization that Logan was still out there, and the danger was far from over. Weston acted quickly. The very next morning, he walked into the village police station, a weathered satchel slung over his shoulder. Inside it, he carried everything he needed to expose Logan. Notes he had scribbled about his suspicions, the vial's residue tested by the same toxicologist Logan had visited, and witness accounts he'd gathered from his quiet observations around town. Weston might have been absent from his daughters' lives for years, but he was not a man to leave things half done when it mattered. The officer on duty, a young man barely old enough to grow a decent beard, looked up in surprise as Weston stepped in. "What can I do for you, sir?" he asked. "I need to speak to someone in charge," Weston said firmly. "This concerns a matter of life and death." By the end of the day, the warrant for Logan Jones's arrest had been issued. It didn't take long for the police to track him down. He was living in a rented room above the village's only tavern, his charm having long since worn thin with those who knew him best. Logan didn't resist when the officers came for him, but his smirk stayed fixed in place as they cuffed his hands behind his back. "That old man finally lost his marbles, huh?" he said as they led him down the narrow stairs. "You'll see soon enough. This is all a big misunderstanding." Sophie and Alina heard the news that evening. Weston returned to the small cottage they had taken refuge in, his face tired but triumphant. "It's done," he told them. "He's in custody." Sophie's lips pressed into a thin line. "Good. He doesn't deserve to walk free after everything he's done." Alina sat silently for a moment, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Weston sighed, taking a seat across from them. "They'll question him, gather more evidence, and then there will be a trial." Sophie stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I need to see him." Alina looked up sharply. "Sophie, why? After what he did?" "I need to face him," Sophie interrupted, her voice steady despite the storm of emotion brewing beneath it. "He owes us that much." The sisters were granted a meeting with Logan in the days before the trial. It took place in a small, dimly lit room at the police station, separated from the main holding cells by a thick steel door. Logan was seated at a plain wooden table, his hands cuffed in front of him. He looked up as they entered, his expression a strange mix of defiance and something almost like regret. "Well, if it isn't my favorite girls," he drawled, leaning back in his chair. "What's this? A family reunion?" Sophie's fists clenched at her sides, but she held her ground. "How could you?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "We trusted you. I trusted you." Logan's smirk faltered for a moment before he shrugged. "It wasn't personal," he said, his tone casual. "Things got complicated. I had to look out for myself." Alina's voice was soft but cutting. "You tried to take everything from us. Our lives. Our future. Do you even feel any shame?" For the first time, Logan looked away, his gaze dropping to the table. "I never meant for it to go that far," he muttered. "But once you're in deep, there's no easy way out." Sophie stepped closer, her voice rising. "No easy way out. You had a choice, Logan, and you chose to betray us." Logan didn't respond. The weight of their words seemed to settle over him, his bravado crumbling piece by piece. By the time the officers escorted Sophie and Alina from the room, he was slumped in his chair, staring blankly at the wall. The trial was swift. With Weston's testimony, the toxicologist's analysis, and the sisters' own accounts, the case against Logan was ironclad. The courtroom was packed with villagers, their murmurs filling the space as the judge read the charges. When the verdict was delivered, guilty on all counts, Sophie and Alina let out a collective breath they hadn't realized they were holding. Logan was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, his charm and smooth talking unable to save him from the consequences of his actions. As he was led away in chains, Sophie turned to Alina, her eyes shimmering with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "It's over," she said softly. Alina nodded, though her expression remained pensive. For now. In the weeks that followed, life began to take on a new rhythm. Sophie and Alina stayed close to Weston, their bond with him slowly mending as they navigated the aftermath of Logan's betrayal together. The weight of their shared trauma didn't vanish, but it grew lighter with each passing day. One evening, as the three of them sat by the fire, Sophie reached for Alina's hand. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything. For the lies. For keeping you in the dark. I should have trusted you." Alina squeezed her sister's hand tightly. I'm sorry too, for not speaking up when I should have. We let him divide us, but he didn't win. Weston watched them silently, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. For all the pain and mistakes that had brought them here, there was something stronger growing in its place, something that felt like hope. 9 months passed quietly, the rhythm of life reshaping itself into something new, something gentler. The heaviness of the past remained, but it no longer smothered them. It hung in the background, a shadow cast by distant memories as Sophie and Alina embraced the present. The first cries of their children pierced the stillness of an early autumn morning, bringing with them a flood of emotions neither sister could have prepared for. Sophie cradled her newborn sons in trembling arms, their tiny fingers curling instinctively around hers. Beside her, Alina gazed in awe at her own daughters, their soft whimpers stirring something deep and profound within her. For the first time in what felt like forever, the house was filled with life. Motherhood came with its own set of challenges, but Sophie and Alina faced them together, just as they had everything else. The long nights of sleeplessness and the endless hours of feeding and soothing weren't easy, but they were shared. Sophie often found herself laughing quietly at the absurdity of it all, how these tiny beings could turn their world upside down with such ease. Alina, ever the planner, approached parenting with a careful determination. She read every scrap of advice she could find, though most of it felt irrelevant to their little cottage life. What mattered, she soon realized, wasn't following rules or perfect schedules. It was the small moments, the warmth of a baby's hand against her cheek, the way her daughter's giggles lit up the room. That made all the difference. Weston, for his part, became a steadfast presence. Though he never said it outright, his regret for the years he'd spent apart from Marta was evident in the way he doted on his grandchildren. He spent hours carving tiny wooden animals for them, his rough hands surprisingly gentle as he passed the toys to the babies. "They remind me of her," he said one afternoon, his voice soft as he rocked one of Alina's daughters to sleep. Marta. She would have loved this. Sophie, standing nearby with her own son nestled against her shoulder, nodded. She would have. There was a peace between them now, an unspoken understanding that the past couldn't be changed, but it could be honored. Sophie and Alina had made a promise, to each other and to themselves, that they wouldn't let the mistakes of the past dictate the future. As the children grew, so too did the bond between the sisters. They often found themselves talking late into the night, their voices low, so as not to wake the little ones. The conversations ranged from the mundane to the deeply personal, each one building on the trust they'd rebuilt. "Do you ever think about her?" Sophie asked one evening, her eyes distant as she gazed at the fire. "Mama, I mean." Alina nodded, her fingers tracing patterns on the edge of her blanket. "Every day, especially when I look at them." She gestured toward the room where their children slept. "I think about what she'd say, what she'd do differently." "She did her best," Sophie said after a moment, "even if it wasn't perfect." Alina's lips curved into a faint smile. "I suppose that's all any of us can do." Weston's presence became an anchor for them. He was no longer the distant figure they'd grown up resenting, but a quiet force of support. He taught the children how to tend the garden, his patience unwavering as tiny hands fumbled with seeds and tools. On rainy days, he told them stories about their grandmother, his voice filled with a reverence that softened the sharp edges of the past. "She was stronger than anyone I've ever known," he said one evening as the children sat around him, their eyes wide with wonder. "She fought for what she believed in, even when it wasn't easy." Sophie and Alina listened from the doorway, their hearts swelling with gratitude. It was a side of Marta they hadn't fully appreciated before, and hearing Weston speak of her with such love brought a sense of closure neither of them had realized they needed. As the years passed, the little cottage became a haven, not just for their family, but for the memories they carried. The laughter of children echoed through its halls, mingling with the whispers of the past. Sophie and Alina often spoke of the lessons they'd learned, not just from their mother, but from their own journeys. "Life isn't about avoiding pain," Sophie said one evening as they watched the sunset together. "It's about finding the strength to keep going, to love, even when it's hard." Alina reached for her sister's hand, squeezing it gently, and to forgive. Not just others, but ourselves. Weston, sitting nearby with a grandchild on his lap, nodded in agreement. "You two have learned more than most do in a lifetime," he said, his voice filled with pride. "Your mama would be proud." In that moment, surrounded by love and the quiet hum of life, Sophie and Alina knew they had found what Marta had always wanted for them: peace, happiness, and the strength to build a future rooted in love. Their story wasn't one of perfection, but of resilience. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting its golden light over the cottage, it was clear that their journey, though marked by tragedy, had led them to a place of profound and enduring hope. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it. Leave a comment to tell us how it inspired you, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. May God bless you and be with you every step of the way.